historical works depends entirely on two manuscripts, one of the 9th century, one of the 11th, so 900 to 1,000 years after his writing. And then Bruce points out at the end, after giving further examples, no classical scholar would listen to an argument that the authenticity of these writers is in doubt because the earliest manuscripts of their works, which are of any use to us, are, in this case, over 1,300 years later than the originals. Here we know when the people wrote. The manuscripts we have for some of the great historians of the day, the earliest ones are 1,300 years after the fact, and Bruce says no historian would ever question their reliability. The reliability of the overall testimony. But how different is the situation of the New Testament in this respect? In addition to the two excellent manuscripts of the 4th century mentioned above, which are the earliest of some thousands known to us, considerable fragments remain of papyrus copies of the books of the New Testament dated from 100 to 200 years earlier still. The Chester Beatty Biblical Papyri, the existence of which was made public in 1931, consist of portions of 11 papyrus codices, 3 of which contain most of the New Testament writings. One of these, containing the 4 Gospels with Acts, belongs to the first half of the 3rd century. Another, containing Paul's letters to the churches and the Epistle of Hebrews, was copied at the beginning of the 3rd century. The third, containing Revelation, belongs to the second half of the same century. And it goes on and on with further evidence. Some scholars said, well, John's Gospel was not even written until well over 100 years after Jesus. And yet, a papyrus codex containing John 18:31 through 33 and 37:38 is dated to around 130, the actual manuscript. So it's just like with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, when people question, when were some of these books written? Some radical liberal scholars, and when they question the reliability of the Hebrew text, because after all, the oldest complete copy that we have of the Hebrew Bible is roughly 1,000 years old, meaning roughly 1,300 or 1,400 years after the final books of the Hebrew Bible were written. How reliable could it be? Well, there were meticulous scribal patterns of Jewish people, and the way things were passed on and copied and checked and double-checked, et cetera, et cetera. But then the Dead Sea Scrolls are discovered with manuscripts of almost every book of the Bible, in part at least, the Hebrew Scriptures, going back over 1,000 years earlier than the oldest manuscript that we had. And yet in some cases, word for word, letter for letter, identical. Of all ancient books of the ancient world, the best attested in terms of manuscript evidence is the New Testament. The best attested. You say, but 5,000 different manuscripts, aren't there all kinds of different variations? Yes, they are, and they do not touch on a single doctrinal point or major point of life and death theological interest. Most of the differences are, I want your joy to be full versus I want our joy to be full. Those kinds of things. And in fact, the manuscript variation that you have with the New Testament is just like the manuscript variation you have from the Hebrew Bible and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Some of the texts read word for word, letter for letter, the same as our later rabbinic copies, and some have other variations. The fact is, with both the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Covenant writings, God took extraordinary care to provide for us a reliable witness, to the point that we can read the Bible in English and know that we are basically getting the same message. You could read 50 or 100 different English translations, and you're still going to get overall, at most every point, the same thrust, the same message. If you read the Quran in English, you're not reading the Quran. It's the meaning of the Quran, the translation of the Quran, because technically the Quran could only be read in Arabic. Here, God in His wisdom and grace wonderfully preserved the Scriptures and gave them in such a way that they could be translated and disseminated to the ends of the earth, because His desire is that all people will know Him and serve Him and follow Him. What about the method of interpretation used by the writers of the New Testament? We looked at Matthew, for example, and we said that some scholars think he was, or some writers, some anti-missionaries think he didn't know what in the world he was talking about. He was just messing up verses. And Rabbi Tovia Singer, for example, claimed that's why Jews don't believe in Jesus, because Matthew was so wrong and messed up in his interpretation of Scripture that Jews looked at that and thought, wow, forget this. And then we showed top Matthew scholars who saying Matthew's so deep and rich that you have to dig to see his real point, and then when you get it, it's a treasure. How does this line up with Jewish interpretation of the day? Almost all of the methods of interpretation and the principles of interpretation that are followed by the New Covenant writers are also seen, examples of these seen in the writings of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I go into this at some length in Volume 4. However, the New Testament writers were more contextually careful and less free with the biblical text than were the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls. What about the later writings of the rabbis that ultimately became the Talmud and Midrash and things like that? Let's just take a look. I'm going to give the quickest sampling of the opening pages of the Talmud. The Talmud, every Talmud volume begins on page 2. You kind of jump into an ongoing discussion, so to say. So the first volume of the Talmud, the first tractate, would be like a book of the Bible, is Barachot, dealing with prayers and benedictions. And then, of course, any Talmudic volume then springs off into 20 or 30 different subjects and concepts and weaves back in and out. But I just looked at the first few pages of Barachot, and something actually that I've gone through with rabbis at different times. And then taken any of my conclusions from Orthodox Jewish commentaries on these texts. So this is a fair representation of the first few pages of the Talmud. How does it use Scripture? So on 2a, page 2a, each Talmudic page is front and back, A, B. On page 2a, the end of Deuteronomy 6:7 is cited, when you lie down and when you get up, to explain why the Mishnah, which was the Jewish law code before that, or compilation, to explain why the Mishnah first deals with reciting the Shema, Hear, O Israel, in the evening before dealing with reciting it in the morning. Alternatively, Genesis 1:5 is cited, there was evening, there was morning the first day, as another possible supporting verse. So in other words, why does the Mishnah start dealing with you pray first the evening prayer, then the morning prayer, and then it quotes Deuteronomy 6:7, when you lie down, when you get up, or Genesis 1:5, there's evening, there's morning. And these are the, quote, proofs. Are they actual proofs? Is that what the Bible was talking about in that context? No, but they're just used illustratively. Next, Leviticus 22:7 is cited to explain at what time the priests can partake of their portion of the offering. As rendered in the New Jewish Version, the meaning is straightforward, simple, completely unambiguous. As soon as the sun sets, he shall be clean, the Hebrew v'taher. And afterward, he may eat of the sacred donations, for they are his food. So the Talmud gets into a whole discussion about this and says, does v'taher mean that the man shall be clean? Or perhaps does it mean that the day shall be clean? And this indicates something of the timing. And in other words, the day is clear. And the Talmud ultimately accepts that the meaning of this verse is that the day is clear, not the man is clean, although there is absolutely zero support for this in any Hebrew dictionary, zero support for this in any ancient Jewish translation or any reputable modern translation. Yet, the Talmud actually comes to a legal conclusion based on a complete misunderstanding or misuse or impossible use or unbelievably unlikely use, however you want to pour it, of a Hebrew word. You say, well, didn't they know their Hebrew? Yes, but they used the text with a certain freedom and read insights into it that were really not there. So here, understand this. This is explaining a legal ruling. This is not just a passing discussion, and yet it completely misuses the text that's being cited.